Here's a story we like to tell ourselves. Plant-based medicine was nothing more than primitive guesswork. Fragrant folklore used to mask the scent of bad hygiene or act as a weak placebo. But for most of human history, plants weren't alternative medicine. They were medicine. Everything changed when scientists learned to isolate pure molecules, like morphine from the opium poppy or salicin from willow bark. Suddenly, medicine became more precise, more standardized, and more predictable. A doctor no longer had to prescribe a handful of willow bark without knowing its potency. Instead, they could prescribe an exact, measurable dose of a specific compound. As scientists became better at isolating and synthesizing these chemicals, many people began to see whole plants as relics of the past, crude, inconsistent, left behind by modern science. Or were they? To find out, we have to look back to the late 1700s, a time when a massive scientific shift was quietly beginning. Scientists were no longer satisfied just knowing that a plant worked. They wanted to know why. Take peppermint. It's actually a relatively new plant to humanity, a natural hybrid, an accidental cross between spearmint and watermint. For generations, people had used it simply as a comforting herbal tea to soothe an upset stomach or freshen breath. But in 1771, a German chemist and physician named Hieronymus David Gaubius, working in the Netherlands, decided to look closer. He began experimenting with the distilled essential oil of this hybrid plant and managed to isolate a pure crystalline compound, a molecule we now know as menthol. This was a monumental scientific breakthrough. It was one of the very first times humanity had ever successfully pulled a single, pure active molecule out of an essential oil. And once they had it, they realized its power. This isolated crystal became a prized weapon for respiratory relief and pain management. Menthol doesn't actually lower the temperature of your skin. It literally tricks our nervous system's cold receptors into firing, sending a physical sensation of an icy chill to the brain on command, instantly opening up airways and numbing sore muscles. It's the exact same reason why generations later, that very same plant chemistry became the star active ingredient in household staples we still buy today, like Vicks Vapor Rub, Tiger Balm, and Hall's cough drops. Today, modern clinical research has uncovered peppermint oil's secret digestive power that people knew for generations without formal proof. Scientists discovered that peppermint oil acts as a natural calcium channel blocker. In plain English, it blocks the chemical signals that cause muscle to tense up, effectively forcing the smooth muscles of the human gut to relax and halting painful gastrointestinal spasms in their tracks. The discovery of menthol is evidence that plants weren't just folklore, they were nature's medicine. Moving into the 1830s, the race to map these plant chemicals was rapidly accelerating. Scientists realized that if peppermint contained a hidden molecule that could numb muscles, other traditional plants must be hiding secrets of their own. So they turned their attention to clove. For centuries, cloves were humanity's ultimate emergency remedy for the nightmare of dental infections. Long before modern dentistry, if you had a raging, throbbing toothache, the universal fix was to place a whole clove directly against the tooth and bite down. It tasted intense, but it worked. In 1834, the secret was finally unlocked. A German chemist named Carl Jacob Ettling successfully isolated the heavy-hitting active liquid compound from clove essential oil, a molecule we now know as eugenol. They discovered that eugenol wasn't just a mild placebo. It was a brutal germ killer and a powerful local anesthetic. It worked by temporarily numbing local nerve endings, interrupting the pain signals before they could reach the brain. In an era before modern numbing gels, sterile dental suites, or widespread anesthesia, this single isolated plant molecule was a godsend. But the innovation didn't stop there. By the 1890s, dental pioneers realized that if you mix this isolated eugenol liquid with plain zinc oxide powder, it created a chemical reaction that hardened into a paste. They called it zinc oxide eugenol. Zinc oxide eugenol is still used today. If you walk into a modern dental office for a temporary filling or an agonizing dry socket treatment, there's a high chance your dentist will use that exact same zinc oxide and eugenol paste to calm the nerve. Once again, nature continues to provide the answers and solutions. Modern medicine didn't replace the plant, it simply built on it. Just a decade later, in the early 1840s, science turned its attention to a plant deeply trusted across North America, wintergreen. For generations, Native American tribes had turned to wintergreen leaves to soothe aching joints, treat fevers, and calm overworked muscles. They didn't have microscopes to look inside the leaf, but they knew it held a powerful antidote to deep physical pain. In 1842, a pioneering American pharmacist named William Proctor Jr. began analyzing the oils of sweet birch and wintergreen, recognizing the unique properties of their primary compound. Just a year later, French chemist Auguste Cahors successfully isolated and chemically identified that exact same core molecule, methyl salicylate. What they had actually uncovered was nature's original blueprint for aspirin. They found that this plant compound possessed an incredible ability to rapidly penetrate the skin barrier and target localized inflammation, temporarily switching off the chemical signals that tell our brain a muscle is throbbing. The plant hadn't created a superficial mask, it had created a highly targeted topical line of defense. If that sounds familiar, it's because modern medicine never left it behind. When you walk into a store today and grab a tube of Bengay or Icy Hot to soothe a sore back, you're relying on that exact same plant molecule first mapped out in the 1840s. By the 1870s, the scientific exploration of nature's medicine chest had expanded across the globe, landing in the ancient forests of Australia to investigate the towering eucalyptus tree. For thousands of years, indigenous Australians had relied on eucalyptus leaves as an unmatched remedy for deep respiratory illness. When a member of a tribe suffered from severe chest congestion, a racking cough, or a burning fever, they would infuse the leaves in hot water, creating a powerful vapor to open up the lungs. In 1870, a French chemist named François Stanislas Clove decided to analyze this potent botanical oil. He successfully isolated its primary heavy-hitting active compound, a molecule called 1,8-cineol or eucalyptol. What Clove discovered was a chemical masterpiece designed by nature to clear human airways. 1,8-cineol is a powerful mucolytic, meaning it doesn't just soothe the throat, it physically breaks down the dense molecular bonds of mucus, reducing inflammation in the lungs and forcing the bronchial tract to open up and breathe. Furthermore, it acts as an aggressive antimicrobial agent. This plant compound was so incredibly effective at destroying bacteria and clearing congestion that the emerging field of commercial medicine adopted it almost immediately. In 1879, it became one of the foundational active ingredients in the original formula for Listerine mouthwash. Soon after, in 1894, it became a core pillar of a brand new chest salve that would eventually change the world, Vicks VapoRub. Today, despite all our breakthroughs in synthetic pharmacology, if you look at the back of a Vicks jar or a modern decongestant, that very same molecule from the Australian bush is still doing the heavy lifting. Back in 1906, a young chemical engineer named René Maurice Gattefossé graduated university and stepped right into his family's perfume business. To help improve their fragrances, he went out to the hills of Provence. He spent months working side by side with local farmers, learning exactly how they distilled lavender. If you've ever heard of Gattefossé, you probably know the famous legend. The story goes that he suffered a terrible lab burn, instinctively dunked his hand into a vat of lavender oil, and was miraculously cured on the spot. But the real history, it's much more intense. In July of 1910, a massive explosion tore through his laboratory. Gattefossé was severely burned, but he didn't grab the lavender. He did what any of us would do. He went straight to the hospital. But the medical treatments failed, miserably. Within days, his wounds took a dark turn, and his arm developed gas gangrene. In 1910, that was a literal death sentence. Your tissue was rotting, and there was no coming back. With absolutely nothing left to lose, Gattefossé remembered the farmers in Provence. He tore off the bandages, washed away the hospital ointments, and covered his arm in pure lavender oil. And to the absolute shock of his doctors, the infection stopped dead in its tracks. But this wasn't a miracle. It was pure chemistry. Lavender is loaded with two massive antimicrobial compounds, linalool and linaloyl acetate. Together, they choked out the bacteria, stopped the tissue rot, and forced his skin cells to rapidly regenerate. The experience completely changed his life. Gattefossé dedicated everything to studying plant chemistry, sparking global interest and actually coining the word we still use today, aromatherapy. Then, in 1915, tragedy hit. His older brother, Abel, caught an infectious disease and died during the war. Driven by grief, Gattefossé wanted to get his research onto the battlefield where it could save lives. So, he engineered a water-soluble anti-infective oil blend called Salvo. This stuff wasn't meant for a relaxing spa. It was shipped straight to chaotic military field hospitals and eventually used on the front lines to fight off the deadly 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. The results were so undeniable that frontline surgeons took notice. A prominent military doctor named Dr. Forgues wrote that these concentrated oils were precious products, especially for emergency surgeries and fighting wartime epidemics. Gattefossé spent the next 2 decades compiling his research, culminating in his landmark 1937 book, Aromatherapy. It became the ultimate foundation for the field, proving that plant medicine wasn't just folklore. It was a rigorous science, and because he was the very first to bridge that gap between ancient botanical wisdom and modern clinical data, we know him today as the father of aromatherapy. While the early 1900s focused heavily on European botany, the 1920s brought a completely different kind of breakthrough from the coastal wetlands of New South Wales. For countless generations, the Bundjalung Aboriginal people had treated a specific native tree as their sacred healer. They called it bulam. Growing around lagoons and waterways, its papery leaves released aromatic oils into the water, creating what were essentially natural antiseptic baths. Fresh leaves were crushed onto cuts and skin infections, while their vapors were inhaled to ease stubborn coughs and chest congestion. When British explorer Captain James Cook encountered the tree in 1770, his crew brewed its leaves into a surprisingly spicy drink. He recorded it in his journal and gave it the English name we still use today, tea tree. More than 150 years later, that same traditional remedy caught the attention of Australian government chemist Arthur Penfold. In 1923, an Australian government chemist named Arthur Penfold decided to put this traditional remedy to the test. Using modern lab standards, he distilled the oil from the leaves and ran a series of rigorous tests on typhoid bacteria. What Penfold discovered absolutely stunned the medical community. The primary molecule in the oil, something called terpenin 4-ol, wasn't just a mild disinfectant. Penfold's data proved it was 12 times more powerful at killing bacteria than carbolic acid, the standard universal antiseptic used in Western hospitals at the time. But here was the best part. Unlike those harsh synthetic chemicals, this plant compound didn't burn or corrode human tissue. It attacked pathogens aggressively, but it was incredibly gentle on living skin. Now, normally, when Western science found a compound this powerful, mainstream medicine would immediately try to isolate that single molecule, throw away the rest of the plant, and recreate it synthetically in a factory. But with tea tree, that approach completely failed. Penfold's research began to validate what René Maurice Gattefossé was discovering over in Europe, the whole plant theory. They realized that the tree's power didn't come from terpenin 4-ol acting alone. The oil was actually a living volatile cocktail of over 100 different organic compounds working in perfect harmony. If you isolated just the main molecule in a lab, it lost its punch. It turned out the minor compounds were acting as natural delivery vehicles, helping the main molecule slide through bacterial walls, while other trace elements actively stopped skin irritation. The plant's raw design was already so structurally complex and so perfectly balanced that human labs literally couldn't improve on it. It was infinitely better to just step back, protect the trees, and let nature handle the manufacturing. By the time World War II erupted, the natural power of tea tree oil was so widely recognized across Australia that soldiers voluntarily packed it into their own gear. It wasn't a standard government-issued item, it was a personal necessity. Families tucked bottles of it into care packages, and soldiers scrambled to get their hands on it to fight off tropical skin infections, treat trench foot, and sanitize cuts in the mud. In fact, the demand for this homegrown remedy became so critical that the Australian government officially classified it as an essential national commodity. They actually exempted tea tree harvesters from the military draft, ensuring that the men cutting the leaves in the bush could keep the supply chain moving throughout the war. Fast forward to today, and that whole plant design is exactly why tea tree oil never went out of style. While countless mid-century synthetic antiseptics have been discontinued or replaced, tea tree remains a global staple. Walk into any modern pharmacy and you'll find it front and center in acne treatments, clarifying shampoos, skincare, and natural first aid remedies. Even in a world dominated by advanced pharmaceutical chemistry, we still rely on the exact same complex 100-compound shield that the Bundjalung people used thousands of years ago. As the mid-20th century rolled around, mainstream medicine believed it had permanently conquered the microbial world by isolating single synthetic chemical compounds like penicillin. But as the world sprinted toward laboratory synthetics, a few researchers quietly looked backward to the Mediterranean basin, wanting to understand the chemistry behind one of the oldest, most aggressive defenders in history, wild oregano. For thousands of years, ancient Greek and Roman physicians looked at wild oregano as the undisputed kings of purification. Hippocrates used them constantly to treat severe lung infections and sanitize open wounds. The Greeks actually named oregano oreganos, meaning joy of the mountain, because they noticed that wherever these resilient little herbs blanketed the rocky, sun-baked hillsides, disease had a remarkably hard time taking root. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, this ancient remedy experienced a massive global renaissance as modern medicine began facing a terrifying crisis with antibiotic-resistant superbugs. Microbiologists started analyzing oregano and thyme essential oils to see how their natural chemistry stacked up against modern pharmaceutical drugs. When they mapped the molecules, they found its two primary active components, Carvacrol and Thymol. And this is where medical history comes full circle in a beautiful way. If you look at the chemical structure of these two plant compounds, they are both phenols. If that sounds familiar, it's because phenol is the exact chemical name for carbolic acid, the harsh, burning, universal hospital antiseptic championed by Joseph Lister in the 1800s. Humanity thought we were being incredibly advanced when we synthesized carbolic acid in a lab. But it turned out that nature had already been manufacturing its own natural phenols, except nature did it better. Pure carbolic acid burns and corrodes human tissue. But inside wild oregano and thyme, nature took that exact same phenol ring and subtly modified it, attaching tiny hydrocarbon chains that turned them into Carvacrol and Thymol. Inside the plant, these two molecules work together like a specialized tactical team, demonstrating the ultimate masterclass in whole plant synergy. Carvacrol acts as the heavy hitter. It aggressively punches holes right through the outer cell membranes of harmful bacteria and fungi. Once that protective wall is breached, Thymol rushes inside, disrupts the cell's internal machinery, and completely freezes its ability to replicate. Here's why this matters so much today. Synthetic antibiotics usually target only one specific pathway inside a germ. Because it's a single line of attack, bacteria can easily adapt, mutate, and become drug-resistant superbugs. But because oregano and thyme present a complex, multi-layered phenol shield that hits pathogens from several different angles all at once, bacteria simply cannot figure out how to mutate against it. Today, peer-reviewed clinical studies are continuously rediscovering that these natural, ancient plant phenols remain profoundly effective against lethal strains of bacteria that our single-molecule synthetic drugs can no longer touch. When we look back across the entire timeline of human medicine, a striking pattern emerges. We didn't actually discover these healing molecules in the 19th and 20th centuries. We simply found a new language, the language of chemistry, to describe what humanity had already been practicing for thousands of years. Every single breakthrough we've traced followed the exact same pattern. It began with discovery. We looked at traditional ancient plant remedies and realized they possessed a genuine, undeniable power to heal. Then came the attempt to outsmart nature. Empowered by the dawn of modern laboratories, science entered a massive wave of reductionism. We tried to isolate the one headline molecule, discard the rest of the plant, and mass-produce synthetic copies in a factory. We genuinely believed that human engineering could improve upon, simplify, and outsmart nature's designs. But eventually, we returned. That reductionist approach hit a wall. Whether it was the realization that pure synthetic molecules could cause unintended side effects, or the terrifying modern crisis of bacteria rapidly mutating against single-molecule antibiotics, we found ourselves stuck. And that is where the journey comes full circle. Today, advanced pharmacology is realizing that the plants had the answers all along. The impurities and minor compounds we spent a century throwing away weren't accidental fillers at all. They were nature's built-in safety nets, its penetration enhancers, and its multi-angle defense strategies. By looking at the plant as a whole, just as Gattefossé and Penfold championed, we aren't turning away from science, we are moving toward a more sophisticated version of it. So when you use a pure essential oil, you're using the same complex chemistry that physicians, healers, and scientists have been rediscovering for thousands of years.